다 텔라 찌르도 단다 잘보도 한달라 예당 람당 제부 넘버 좀 예쁘나네 다 당보 예텔라야 당갈와게 네당 방자게 네당 템바다 도지게 네당 템바 라소바 넘버 예예쁘나네 다다디 값수 단다 seksujepa chugupa ta seksujepa nishupati ni tene nekapje pangja ta jerdo tene korwege chunhondabote kandisin jungi yapa ta tene tejendola te neluga ta gamba kapsala tene je nekap je jipa karibala hena nelu matopa te tate sexje pa ni jigone tanda ye ne to tempa je ta tene te je sala sexje pa ni de lam temparela tene yedang lam nigenane lam temparela lam tela yang chitang ke lam je pangji ki chodong lam number ni ye penane lam je pangji ki chode la tene sex je pa ni de ta rimba yindo tembaran je penane tangpo ta chitang ke temu le korwe chunong ju sorte temba yin
tempo de chugopa da nishupa de data de shila shiga kola tene da pangja da de pangja pangwa de nekap che pangja cholok da je bakarik bala shamba pangwa da tene de nishutsa chikpa da nishutsa nipa de ni lamge kola re Continuing from where we left off this morning, if you remember the general outline of the Doha for the king, it treats of first the ground, then the path, and then the fruition. Within the presentation of the ground, there's a presentation of what is to be abandoned, that is to say, bewilderment with regard to the ground, and what is to be realized, which is the nature of the ground itself. In the verse 19 and verse 20, what is presented is the need to abandon the bewilderment, the samsaric bewilderment, and also attachment to logical reasoning and inferential valid cognition. Following that, the 21st and 22nd stanzas, verses will deal with the path.
Ta te nane ta tangbo jerdo khorwala chombe ke chol ta tenin khorwen chunho tenzo jebe ke chol te rela Tene ta te yang cerdo temu linjuan sungri warela. Tene temu ta marikpa te nam chitang ke masalawa mompet nambata jire te yina yang tanda temu hiba te cerdo mombarela. Momba te ten tampe nelu mahibe onto tangna. Tene temu te mombarela. Tene kunzo mchulbe onto xe na, tene temu te jay mompa masalwe nampataba mahimpa, mihibe nampataba jay mahimpa. Temu te salwe nampataba jay re. Temu kunchuntong te, tene kunzo kunchuntong la, jesal la songa taba. Jay la gogi ware la. Tene te yang jitang ke ta tanda dewaraki binimbo xe na yang ra. Chuji yen se na yang ra, tombe ge netang ge on de se na chuji yen, tene salwa yehi ge on de se na dewar ki be nimbo de, senjin tam ji je, senji je la yore la. Te yeba te, ta ngo ma zin ba la, toni in ba la, ngo ma zin ba la, tene, ta kitang ge, tanda nambar hi ba tsuji ge na ne, kunji ge nambar hi ba, marik ba te, chungwa re la. Te maripa tige kandi ji chungwa re se na tene maripa la chitang salwe ge netang te kharwa la tene tene tombe ge nelu te ngui ma zin pa la tene ngui pu ge zamba rabo je hyor ne tene te la tene pacha ge chono namba na choba chungwa yin bichar na tene temu te jesal la sonne tene kunji le nyei nyonga ta tene te le tene number hiba tsu ji te korwe tsu nong kankan juwa tene kap dana la sauna temu salwe samare temu te gen tsu nong te shok chenpo che shong na tene yehi masal te sungzi yehi te ge nelu zipe toni tang nelu zipe yehi te drip ne masal wala togi ware la tene temu te salwa la tene yehi te ge chatawa to chinye pa chenpe yehi la sope yehi te masalwa la te drip togi ware ta yi kondo ndamje nondo rinpoche chok na tene te yinji nobu rinpoche ge we ta yinji nobu rinpoche ge namba la sopa tene la sopa sawa mayimba yendo tene yehi te masalwa la togi ware
Of these verses, the first, verse 19, is concerned with how or why we wander in samsara and how the bewildered appearances of samsara increase or spread. All samsara begins with ignorance, and here ignorance is referred to as a state of stupidity. Now, by its nature, a state of stupidity or stupor, a state of ignorance, is unclear. It is an absence of knowledge, an absence of understanding. From the point of view, or from the aspect of ignorance, which is the mere absence of knowledge, the absence of knowledge of absolute truth, then we could say that ignorance, or as it says in our text, stupidity, are a mere unclarity or lack of clarity. But at the same time, through that lack of recognition of absolute truth, there is a great clarity of stupidity and ignorance in the projection of relative truth. And as samsara increases, it becomes clearer and clearer. The basic nature that lies within each and every sentient being can be called Sugata Garbha or the Dharmadhatu. When we call it the Dharmadhatu, we are primarily referring to its aspect of emptiness. And when we call it Sugata Garbha, we are primarily referring to its aspect of lucidity or wisdom. Now, when this is not recognized, that state of absence of recognition is ignorance. And that is the beginning of the all-basis consciousness from among the 8 consciousnesses. The absence of recognition occurs because through the appearance of the lucidity aspect of the nature, the emptiness or empty aspect of the nature is unrecognized. Through that absence of recognition, through that ignorance and that arising of the 8th consciousness, the habit which gradually produce bewildered appearances accrue. As they accrue, from the 8th consciousness arises the 7th, the consciousness which is mental affliction or kleshas, and eventually the 6 functioning consciousnesses, the 5 sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness. At that point, the structure of the bewildered appearances of samsara is fully established. So the process of the clarification or intensification of samsara is a process in which, as our text says, when stupidity is clear, wisdom is unclear. As the ignorance and stupidity of samsara become more and more vivid and more clear, the underlying wisdom becomes more and more unclear, more and more obscured. Now this is the same idea that was expressed in the previous 18th verse when it said, if a supreme gem is placed in a swampy mire, its radiance, however, will not be clear. The radiance of the wisdom is obscured by the intensity or clarity of the stupidity.
Tene ta te yang chitang ke tangbo maripa kunyi number hipa te ta pacha ke ye ta bu ta senji samno zamke re la tene te la chitang ke maripa rabo jire mato te la pacha ke ye rabo jire mato truba he chewa yo mare te yin ya ta tene tige yurno pacha tela tene nyemo bi ge je dancing number ta tene da yin je number ta je da yin ni ge yawan da je chong tene ti tain do number hi ba chu thu ke ta gong number hi bi yor do tene ta zo da tro rizala so number te kin hi pa cha ka tain do ye pa te gong number hi ba la salbor ton gong number hi ba la salbor ton ne tene te tain do yang trupa hi je number hi ba te ge tene je gong number hi ba te chitang number tomi ta ba je re tomi je ongi per nan ton zam he ta tu zam he ge number la yo re te yin ya tene trupa hi je number hi ba ge tene te la nze pa ta men ze pa ta nyen pa ta min hin pa ta yi do wa dong yi do mong wa la so be ge nam to ton de mong ta ta tu sim te de wa la so be go ni tene trupa te che ru son te tene ta te la te ni nyen mong pa rak pa khang ga ji nyen mong pa rak pa khang ga ji pa la te ni tene le so tene che ge yo re la jun sen te la te ni ta te mu te salto son na ta te la yihi sal na kari yung yo re te mu sal na kari yung yo re se na ta yihi te sal na tene tige tanda nelu ke tante to yo re la te mu te sal na chuno nelu la drip ke chuno te cher ro yin cher na tene dungal te salwa tene ta tela tene tangpo nyemo pa la tene leso pa la tene tene che dungal je namba te ta che to dungal khona yin bi chab ga mare te yin ya ne ka ga devata ba che ta dungal je rang yin te dungal sung ge yo la ne ka devata ba che yin ya ne ka dev namba yo pa re te yin ya te remji njor ne dungal je rang yin den jurwa yin bichir na jurwa dungal da tene chapan duji ji dungal se na ranghin ji ta jiting ke no wanda tam ji jurwa chu jin to jurwa yin bichir na chapan duji ji dungal te dungal som je ranghin te tene jesal ne jesal du son te korun chun no te jumi wa re so.
With the arising of ignorance, or the all-basis consciousness, the ground for the accruing of habit is present. Now, the all-basis consciousness itself, while it is ignorance, is a mere cognitive lucidity. It is not an active state of bewilderment. Nevertheless, because it is the basis for the accruing of habit, it is the basis for the misapprehension of the existence of self, and on the basis of that, the misapprehension of the existence of other. Through the increased accruing of habits on the basis of that twofold misapprehension, the accruing which occurs on or in the all-basis consciousness, the 6 consciousnesses of the 6 gates arise. Now, the 5 sense consciousnesses arise as a result of the habits accrued in the all-basis, but at the same time, they are non-conceptual consciousnesses. The 5 sense consciousnesses are limited in their function to the unique function of each. That is to say, the eye consciousness just sees, the ear consciousness just hears, and so forth. They do not appraise, recognize, judge, or in any way conceptualize what they see and hear, and so on. The 6th consciousness, the mental consciousness, is that which appraises, identifies, and judges what is experienced or perceived by the sense consciousnesses. It is the 6th consciousness that therefore makes errors such as taking different things to be essentially one or the same, and so forth. At this point, with the development of all 8 consciousnesses, there is a state of full-blown or coarse bewilderment. And that is what is called here the increased clarity of bewilderment or stupidity. Now, as it says in the verse, when ignorance and stupidity are clear, wisdom is unclear, and vice versa. When wisdom is clear, the nature of things, the nature of the mind, is realized. But when, on the other hand, bewilderment, stupidity, and ignorance are clear, this nature is obscured. The obscuration of ignorance leads to klesha, or mental afflictions, which lead to the accumulation of karmas, or afflicted actions, which lead to suffering. Now, strictly speaking, we would say that not everything that results from actions is suffering, because actions are of different types, and therefore their results accord with this. But nevertheless, directly or indirectly, the results of afflicted actions are suffering. For example, an experience of suffering is obviously suffering, is the suffering of suffering. But even an experience of happiness or well-being that arises as the result of afflicted action, because it is impermanent, will change into a state of suffering. And in that sense, even states of temporary well-being are the suffering of change. Furthermore, the pervasive environment in which this occurs, that is to say, impermanence, which causes everything to turn eventually into suffering, is the all-pervasive suffering, or the pervasiveness of suffering. So with the development of these 3 types or 3 aspects of suffering, the full bewildered projections or appearances of samsara have occurred.
Tene ta te ni te pete ya. Tene ta perna tangpo temu le temu salne remji dunghan jung ki cholte pe khandi chire se na saben le ta tangpo saben chi yo. Tene saben ti sala tabne sala nyugu chunchun chen jong. Tene nyugu chunchun te rimbe ki cheje sonne tene dongpo tong yargala sopa njungi yo re la pe te yendo chulbe tsawa temu chay yapa te le tene remji pel ne tene chulbe nongwa tamchi njong yen tene korwe chunong ka dunghal te njungi yo re sonne ta te pe go ne tenpa re la tene ta te tardo ta korwe chunong te njungsul tenpa di hyok la tene ta ngaranzo tene nyangin linde pe lamdo drip ke chul te ya salbur ten ya la ta jerdo ngaranzo tanda korwen chunhong la ne pe kap ndana la tene kap ka la dunghal ji dunghal yo are kap ka la njurwe dunghal yo are kap ka la chapan tu ji dunghal ta demba yimbe cherna tene dunghal jerang hinta demba ji re la 다 디 둥할 때 매퍼 세팔라 테네 가리고기 요아레세는 녜mom바 춘홍라소 바데 빵고기 요아레라 테네 다디 넘버 히베게 단젠게 짜와타 짜와르 저베게 녜mom바데 빵고기 요아레라 녜mom바데 뽕어 세팔라야 짜와티 다 마리파디 빵고기 요아레 다 때무살위 Yeshe masalawasindo kanga nelu katela drip ndokite maripato mombato temuti ri yore la mombate salgu yore mombate kandije ge momba chungare se na teni perna chuini ge nelu tingaranso le yepala yepar manthon ne teni mombare ge yore ti chuini ge nelu tingansum don ton na teni ti topchi teni maripate ranging don chuini ki nelu do do yo la teacher na cherdo ta jache wan do yo on de sena chuini ki chuji yengda yeshe je yermi songdun ju bala so ba ten na yo la tene ngaran so tomo ma in ba shaja chimbu ga lam ni na tene ta ti ki te cham jache wa te ne kap chal do temba ma in ba wona gari chal do temba re sena sapa song ha in be cher na tene khatu la rang semje tate tupai ji number hib nelu inaya rong kinji number hib nelu inaya rong te tate ge semje nelu ge ngola te ne ti semje nelu ge ngote ngar mato parela mato par chul parela ti ge nelu la ta onde tini nelu ngo tomba tang ronghin sa ne tang te tini ngo so ngon che ne tini te ngon to gam ne tini te nelu te to na tini te la te ne ta tanda konto pe yopa ta bega savante me pa sepa la tini nyogo ton tini yarga ta loma tamchi me par ndo ayenda la tini tamchi dungala soba tamchi pang tu gi yore la teacher na ngaran su chaji chimpo gambe ke tante pe kalche wa imba te pare
In verse 19, an analogy is presented for how the progressive clarification or intensification of stupidity causes suffering. The analogy is from a seedling arises. With the seedling as a cause, small branches appear. It starts with a seed, and the seed here is like ignorance. You have a seed, you plant it in the ground, and therefore it eventually produces a sprout or seedling from which emerges a stalk and eventually branches and so forth. In the same way, through the progressive intensification of bewilderment or stupidity, we eventually come to suffer. We remain, therefore, in the midst of the bewildered appearances of samsara, which are always, in one way or another, suffering. Sometimes we experience manifest suffering, the suffering which is suffering. Sometimes we experience the suffering of change, and sometimes we just experience pervasive suffering, but we always experience suffering. Now, at the same time as this analogy shows us how bewilderment increases and suffering develops, by implication, it also shows us how to put an end to this. What we want is to stop suffering. Therefore, since the cause, the immediate cause of suffering is mental affliction or kleshas, clearly to get rid of the three sufferings, we have to eradicate the kleshas. When we look to see what the cause of the kleshas is, we see that the cause of the kleshas is this bewilderment, ignorance, or stupidity. Therefore, to get rid of the kleshas, we obviously have to get rid of our stupidity. Now, remember that stupidity begins or began with not seeing dharmata, our own nature. Therefore, clearly the remedy to stupidity, that which will get rid of it, is to see that nature exactly as it is. If one sees the nature, dharmata, stupidity, ignorance, bewilderment will vanish. Now, from the point of view of the sutras, which emphasize vastness, we would refer to this nature as dharmata, the nature of all things, which is often explained as the unity of expanse and wisdom. From the point of view of secret mantra, which emphasizes profundity, and therefore does not focus so much on the vast scope of the nature, we would refer to this as the nature of our mind. You can think of it as the nature of the sixth consciousness or the nature of the eighth consciousness. In either case, it is by looking at the nature of your mind that ignorance will be removed. We are bewildered, ignorant, and stupid because we have never looked at, seen, and realized this nature. Therefore, if we directly recognize the nature, we eliminate ignorance, which is like the seed, and therefore the seedling will not appear, the stalk will not appear, and the branches will not appear.
Tene ta te jesula ta ngaranso ge tanda tu som ton gombe ge nyamlin ni ge na ne zo chewa gombe nyamlin de kal chewa impala temper separe la tene ta te la ya tu som ge zawa ten la pa pa kapsala chu tham ji ne lu tomba ni ten la pa gre Chu tamchi je nelu tomba ni de ten la papa kasala tene ta ti ge ripi ge ta hin che pare ripi ge ta hin chi ni chu tamchi tomba ni yembe ge junsen kande yemba tene ngu po rapa tamchi madrupa ngu po rapa tamchi te ta ngu po trawa tuma ndu pe kombe yembe chena madrupa yemba ta tene ngu po trawa tuma ndu pa te ya tene nang silver tang na tene tenzo te tardo madrupa tene toni do tenla pa ne tene tawa yo madrupa tene chi yul madrup na nang sem jang madrupa ta yul la tene jo yin becher na chi yul madrup na nang sem jo madrupa la so to go ne tene ta te ripa ripa sen toni de tenla pa ripa la chi to target ripa sen kinta tenen taigi jiawanga per ripa la so bata ripa namba ye ripa yada ripa nga la so bata tende song yo la tenen tige cheiton tumi ge sem la ta tige ta chi se ni chu tong ji dong ni de tena papa te tenen ta tanda 다 따지 세바 되게 되네 지탕가 돈이 또 그거 세게 요래데 이나야 대라 해나 되네 대라 햄바지니 대코나게 조시다부지 지나 되게 히라팽게요 말이 다 대답이 투성 그거네 리피트나 파파티 강그처들라 파게 요래세나 주니게 내루랑 이시 야보 제제게 쳤들라 드네 리피트하지 세바래 주니게 내루랑 이시 야보 지바티 다 가르레세나 드네 띵엔전지 냠네 감 야보지 용게 쳤데 때나 파파래 라 드네 티처나 드네 단다 감게 냠네 매빠제다 냠네 매빠제라 리피게 따힌지네 드네 다 단다 디게 타니 건접 그쳐라 촐나 드네 다 대답 감라 때네 드네 지탕게 단다 리피게 따힌지 발라테는 니히제 그래라 니히데 네갑 지바게 히랍지레 다 텔라테네 테네 렘지 감네 감나 테네 네갑 그 지바게 리파마임바 테네 감중 그 히랍제 그래라 감중 그 히라데 응섬도 냠스뇽 이히제레라 텔라 힌도 살와레 다 티처나 살와 빵네 성네 다 디살와데 파빵네 되니 다 단다 내가 지바게 히랍 점라 출니 디나 되니 디게 네루 텔라 마핀바 네루 텔라 네반다보지 용거요라 되니 감들 사라하게 인다타부송하라 대전도 단다 제 타포르무치게 제진 밀레 다포르무치라 당완노 갑슬라 샤자 쳔보 감베투 감두스 세메 조로와 마케제 지다 티갑슬라 데니 리비타 히제 파텐데 히라 마지 존생 카레레시나 무토 이히 yar니 송하레라 다 텔란툴니 데니 강중기 히라데 제라 제마도 바체 무토 비히디 yarndog 요레 송하레라 존생 티처나 데니 다 티게 제동토마 델위게 리파 코나라 히나 데니 살와티 이히게 살와티 강중기 히라데 뽕니 스바타던로 고르긴 춘홍데 파빵마도 받지는 거는 춘홍라 로그레스
Verse 20 is concerned with the relationship between the discernments arising from hearing and thinking on the one hand, and from meditating on the other. It is concerned with the relative importance of these two aspects, and with showing that meditation is more important, finally, than hearing and reflection. Through cultivating the proper discernment of hearing and thinking, one can establish that emptiness is the nature of all things. In order to do this, one employs various modes of logical analysis or reasoning to show that with regard to external things, the coarse are merely aggregates of the subtle themselves further aggregates, and so on, until one shows that things have no true existence. And with regard to the mind, one determines that in the same way, the mind is an aggregate, and so forth. The types of reasoning used to determine this in the context of hearing and thinking are the 4 or 5 great reasonings of the Middle Way school, such as the refutation of things being truly one or many, the refutation of production through the 4 extremes, and so forth. Now, doing this definitely assists the understanding of emptiness. But what it produces is an intellectual or conceptual certainty. If you retain attachment to that conceptual certainty, to that conceptual view of emptiness, then you prevent that conceptual view from performing its true function. Because the purpose of generating the discernments of hearing and reflection is to become certain that emptiness is the nature of all things, so that you are inspired to thereafter meditate on it and experience and realize it directly. If you do not practice meditation, then you will not be able, through that conceptual certainty alone, to relinquish attachment to the ordinary. This can only be relinquished by the third type of discernment, the discernment that arises from meditation, which is, compared to the other two, very clear or lucid, because it is based on direct valid cognition. Therefore, our stanza says, if in analyzing the mind with the reasoning of neither one nor many, you discard the clear here refers to the clarity of that discernment which arises from meditation. Now, about the relationship between the practice of meditation and hearing and reflection, Jetsun Milarepa at one time advised Lord Gampopa as follows: when practicing Mahamudra, do not engage in logical analysis. If you do, non-conceptual wisdom will vanish. In that way, if you remain attached to conceptual view, the view arrived at through logical analysis, you will not be able to transcend the bewildered appearances of samsara, and therefore will continue to fall into existence.
Tene ta te tabu ge tene ti tong toma tope ripati khona la hini nyamsu mne pa te tenzo tong yin ton tong don ro la ta ko tong yin de la ma tong ge non de chung ya pa na yin ji re la de le ni ji wa ne ji yi ze ta de le ni ji wa ji kan yo re ta ji dang ge sen jin ko wa lan chang ge yo re ko wa lan chang ba de ka re se na ma hi ni ko wan chang ba re la tene tanda jai dong toma khona la hin ne tene ta tomba ni je senji ne lu gata ma gamba te kare re se na tene ti tambu ma hi ba mari hi yendo la tene tong dun chung re la tene ni ji ji yor du ba ta ba ji re so re la tene teacher na ta chitang ge zo ngaran so ge yin ji min ji tene nyomlin se go ge yo re la tene te ya chitang ume ripi ge tachi maji na buji sung yo re te yin ya ume ripi ge tachi se ba te kap kap la ta nyam to ba ji la chi ge tro se ge yo re re te yin ya te la hin na te khona la hin ni gam chi ge tro to manjurwa tene gam te pa pambege ta korsan ra bote lan ro in bicherna inji minji de kalchi wa re zumare la per na jesi mala rebe jong tene chaje chembo gong du so tseme jorwa ma ke jai muto hi yalni yo so ate kande jere sena chitang ripi ta hi che pa cham ji muto bi hi yal dog rebe sena yal dog mare te ina ya te la hi ni tene gom de yapo nyamlin se ju ma jung na te muto hi de ndrep to ro in bicherna te tabu tene muto hi yalni yo so re la junsin teacher na te la tene chirulje ripi tahin jepa khona la hini tene nang tingen zai magam pa te la tene pe ta korsan ra bo chembo yimba tene te ya chitang ta te la mahin na yapore te la henju ge nyen kha ye ban ra bo je ye pichna te la pe kal chewal sumai.
Now, our stanza says, while seeing that suffering you fall into its bottomless pit, how could one have anything but compassion for this? This means that if, having arrived at a conceptual certainty of emptiness through the application of reasonings such as there being neither one nor many, and so forth, you maintain your attachment or retain attachment to that conceptual certainty and fail to make proper use of that certainty through the practice of meditation, then you are like someone who knowingly jumps into a bottomless pit. The bottomless pit here is samsara. And beings are constantly jumping into that pit, but they do so without knowing that they're doing it. So in a sense, it's not hard to understand. What is even more tragic, however, than jumping without knowing you're doing it into the bottomless pit is when someone knows it's a bottomless pit and still jumps into it. And that's what you're doing if you retain attachment to the conceptual certainty achieved through analysis and do not practice meditation. Now, here, our text implies that you should not employ the middle way reasonings such as neither one nor many at all, and should just practice meditation. In practice, it is helpful from time to time to continue to use these reasonings. But what you need to ensure is that you do not become attached to the maintenance of the conceptuality or the conceptual certainty which you generate through the reasonings. So the problem is not the reasonings or the certainty they produce, but attachment to it. For example, in the quotation from Jetsun Milarepa, while meditating on Mahamudra, do not engage in logical analysis. Non-conceptual wisdom will vanish if you do. In fact, it is not the logical analysis or the certainty that it produces that is the problem. It is if you become attached to that certainty and therefore neglect direct experience through the practice of meditation. So what this verse is saying is, do not become so attached to the logical analysis of external phenomena and so forth that you ignore the practice of meditation and the development of direct experience. And by implication, since our text warns us of this, it is saying that there is a danger of this kind of attachment occurring.
Tene ta tige ye nelu tempate ta sachi number ye gone tempate tuparela ta te jisla tene lom chaja chempo ye parela lom chaja chempo nyamsel lembe ke sur tela ya chitang ke lom tela ngaran so lom la hyuk gukrela lom la hyuk ni ta thatu ke ndebu ke tendo lep gu yore tene tela ya lam tela chaja hyupa chamchi ndigi yore bisena ndigi yo mare tene te lam manoro wala hyuk gu yore la tene lam norwa te pang gu yore la tene lam nor na yo nor manor samne lam la hyuk na te ndigi yo mare la junsin teacher na kap ndar ta yewan ra bochi na ka sala number ni na ne lam lop lam la hyamba tang ta ti lam lopa la hyamba tang ma che da tene chaja chimbi lam ngu hyeba te number ni yo la tene te na ne tang bo lopa lam la hyamba tang wa te la lopa lam la hyamba tang lopa lam da boche lam ta lam norwe ge yen da boche la number ji te yo la tene te na ne ta tang bo tablam ge kor tablam ge kor la tene ta che hyecha te sam ma je ba sungi yorela tene chitang tablam te tene zani tablam te la tene drebu tobju meba revesina mare tablam tene drebu tobju yore te yinaya tablam te la tro te trolam ge chuni ge nelu dan seni ge nelu tobe nyamnyo je gogere mato ti nyamnyo de meba tablam changba te na tini ti ge te la penton rabo yungi yo mare ti ge ta trolam ge nyamnyo ton dembe go ne tablam te na tablam te la pembe ge trot nang yo re ti yinaya te mayin ba tablam changba tini semje nelu to ba to chuni ge nelu to ba kanya meba tablam changba te na tini ti pen to yo mare.
That completes the presentation of ground Mahamudra in 4 sections in our text. We next, therefore, turn to path Mahamudra. With regard to the path, we need to enter the path, and having entered it, we need to reach the end of the path, which is the fruition. Just entering the path is not enough. In order to reach the end, we have to make sure that we enter the path correctly, and therefore enter the correct path, and that we avoid the wrong path. Therefore, here, in the presentation of path Mahamudra, there are 2 sections. The first is discarding attachment to mistaken paths, and the second is a presentation of the authentic or actual path of Mahamudra. The first of these, teaching us to discard attachment to mistaken paths, has 8 sections. The first of these 8 sections is verse 21. Essentially, verse 21 seems like a generalized criticism of the path of method. In fact, what Saraha is saying in verse 21 is not that the path of method does not work, that it will not lead to the fruition. It's that if the path of method is not accompanied by a recognition of the mind's nature, it won't work. The path of method alone, which is to say the pursuit of the path of method without the aspect of the path of liberation, the recognition of mind's nature, will not lead to liberation and omniscience. On the other hand, if the path of method includes or is accompanied by the recognition of the mind's nature, it will effectively lead to the fruition.
Tene ta tela ya cerdo tablam dong tablam namba ni le chepra yore la tene tela tablam dong tablam ni ka ta damba ji chona chepra dong papa ji re ma to tene tablam me petro ni ka nyam do gam na ya pu ji ba ji da tablam me petrolam chang ba ji gam na de ya tene lam yakpo chaitan te toja yapa chaitan pangja na pong thupa chaitan ton drevi yen te thop thupa chire te yina ya trolam me pe thablam changba je gamna tene tel tene drevi te jachim bu jugu yo mare la tene junsin teacher na tanda dana la thablam ga lam tenzo la tene ta khowal chamgre lam norgre sin sumare la tene te ya tangbo leja la tempa sumare la tene kahi ge leja ge dewa te ta ndi nang du song na leja ge dewa te ten tamba yin se ne tene nagi yore te hie ge yore te hie pa te ngune ge nelu hie ne hie pa ji re te yena nelu ma hie ne hie pa ji re se na te mong bu ge na wa nelu ma hie ne hie pa ji re la tene ti ge leja ge tablam changba ti ge tene kanya phenge yo mare perna ngaranso depe yenten la long chen ken ji yena tene chimdo de ne ta pe go ne ten chimdo de ne depe yenten la long che na se ku nor long che la so bala tene long che na pe long che ji yo re te yena ya tene den long che go den long che la chimni long ma che ba khombe chirul to ten ne tene depe yenten ke tam ra wo che he na te la tene phemban ra kan yo mare ngarang yu cha re la teacher na ta tanda trolam je nyamnyong don dembe go ne tene thalam te te na telan dev ji junju yo re te yina yo trolam me pe thalam changba te la tene dev kanya thoya yo mare so
In this regard, there is a difference between the path of method and the path of liberation. Probably the most effective or best way to practice the path is with the integration of the path of liberation and the path of method. If that is not possible, however, one can practice the path of liberation alone, without the path of method, and it will still be a good and effective path. It will lead to the abandonment of what is to be abandoned, the realization of what is to be realized, and therefore the fruition. But if, on the other hand, one attempts to practice the path of method in the complete absence of the path of liberation, this will not lead to any significant or worthy result. Now, in verse 21, Saraha is specifically criticizing the view that the practice of Mahamudra alone, in the absence of the wisdom of Mahamudra, will lead to awakening. And the analogy that he brings up is, for example, if you are at home in your house and enjoying all the good things that you have in your house, you can enjoy them. If you sit outside your house, refusing to go in, and merely talk about the good things that are in your house, you can talk about them, but you can't actually enjoy them. In the same way, when you attempt to practice the path of method in isolation, without the path of liberation, you're like the person who is sitting outside his house and therefore not enjoying the things within it that he is describing.
Tene ta te jes la nipa te ta thalon yenda la ta thalon tangbo te leja la che thalon nipa te cha dong long dong thile la so ba gamba la so re la tene ta te ya cherdo tanda long la tempa long la tene ta long la tene thalon gamba la tene ta tige zadang longdang tile la sopa tapsul tap number na sopa tene zune tene gomna tene teya ta tanda kondu hiba ta jikparela tene cherdo ngaranso ge zalung tile gomge yore tene gomba tige pengi yore pengi yopa te kang te ne pengi yore se na tene trolam ge nyamnyo chepar chinda den baton senji ne lu to nyamnyo to dembe go ni tene zalung tile ge nyamni che na tene ti ge to pa te compare ton ro se ge yore la tene ta te main pa tene tanda senji ne lu to ge nyamnyo khaya me pa che ge go ni shaje chimbu ge ne lu to nyamnyo me pa la tene za dang long dong ti le tang ba je gam na tene te la tembe ge de ja chimbu jin jong tu yo ma re.
So verse 21 is about the practicing or criticism of the practice of Mahamudra in isolation from the wisdom of Mahamudra. The next subject, which is described in verse 22, is a similar criticism of attempting to practice the disciplines of the channels, winds, and drops without the aspect of the path of liberation or Mahamudra. The type of practice that Saraha is referring to here is the practice where you manipulate your channels, winds, and drops, and thereby experience various things. Now, we do practice using the channels, winds, and drops, and we derive benefit from doing so. But the benefit of these practices consists of the fact that they can increase or enhance your experience of your mind's nature, your experience of the path of liberation. Therefore, if there is no experience whatsoever of the path of liberation, no practice of Mahamudra, and no experience of the mind's nature to begin with, simply working with the channels, winds, and drops in isolation will not produce any significant result.
Tene ta te tabu ge zalung la kerdo ta nyamnyong me pe zalung te la 펜토 아침 보여 말이라 되니 텔카가 렌카용 요래 손네 동이 잘와른 줄 남줄바 되니 때지 된데 강가야 깝깔 찌세그래 티처나 다 단다 감들 저저침 비명하고 온드세나 조다 돌람 쳬버지 조월 땜반제 바이 비처나 단다 베 지당그 탈론동 돌람 이게나네 돌람 갈치와 인바 탈론 건나요 대념들라 돌람 그바 다 텐데 템버런세 바라 티 디게 다 체스제바 남지 단다 가리 템버레세나 공도 템베게 틱토털게 리발라소베게 다 힌제버 메지순게텔라 조다 케바동 주투 이게나네 강 갈치게레세나 드바토바데 갈치게레 테네 헤랍 치와타 냠린 세바니 테 강칼체 그레세나 냠린 세바테 칼체기 요레 소테타 테네 단다 세수제바 니슈 짜지바타 니스타지바로 다티 세수제바 제마니 보테 람지가스 템베 세수제바 니보테 니슈짜지바타 니슈짜니바 니보테게 테네 레자타 테네 단다 짤롱그 맹와니 레 샤제침보 감바테 갈체게레 테네 네루 또바타 네루 마토바니게는 네루 또바테 갈체게레 네루 마토나 탑게 차티게 대점 팽기요 말이라 네루 또나 테네 탑 지차 냠니 마지나야 제또 그래라 탑지 차티 냠니 세나야 텔테네 펜도 용 그래 티처나 샤제침보 감바테 힌도 갈체와 레소인서
Not only is the practice of the channels, winds, and drops without any experience of the nature of mind of no benefit, but it may actually be dangerous. As it says in our verse, overwhelmed, the yogi faints away. So here, in this Doha, which is about the practice of Mahamudra, there is a clear emphasis on the path of liberation. It's important to understand, however, that what is being said here is not that the path of means is invalid or useless, but that for it to be effective and genuine, the path of liberation must be present. In short, the path of liberation is more important. This is not that different from the previous stanzas dealing with the importance of not relying solely upon the conceptual certainty derived from the reasonings of neither one nor many, or the wisdom, the discernments of hearing and reflection. Of greater importance than the conceptual certainty, which is the discernment arising from hearing and reflection, is the direct realization, which is the discernment arising from meditation. In the same way, of greater importance than the practice of the methods of karma mudra or the channels, winds, and drops is the practice of Mahamudra. In short, what really matters, what is of utmost importance, is recognition of the nature of one's mind. If this recognition is present and the path of method is not practiced, there will still be liberation. And if this recognition is absent, no matter how much you practice the path of method, there will not be liberation. We're going to stop there for this afternoon and now practice a little meditation.
Hoy kari rawe
gorwe Gyamtso